Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to do some Christmas cards in July. Now, I know it's too early for some people, but for some people, this is the perfect timing. And Spellbinders has a couple new Christmas releases. This one is called Home for the Holidays. It comes with some fabulous plates, press plates, dies, as well as an embossing folder, some great press plate sentiments, and a few different fonts and styles. So perfect for lots of different tastes. And then my favorite are the new Better Press registration plates. This one is Dashing Reindeer. Then we have Color Mix Mary and Color Mix Joy. And I absolutely love the nice bold fonts on them. I also love this confetti. It looks like snow to me, but I think you could also use it for birthday card celebrations. Then last but certainly not least, there are two plates in this set. Mine are just sticking together. There's a positive and a negative image for pine branches. So they're great for doing, lots of great ones for doing backgrounds as well as images. I'm starting with the Dashing Reindeer. Spellbinders sent a bunch of these over to create with and share with you. So we're going to create 5 different holiday cards in this video. These Better Press registration plates come with a registration card, and it is nice and clear. It shows you exactly where to put each one of those plates. I like to tape it in place on the base of my Better Press system to make sure that it's not going to move and shift on me. I'm using tawny brown ink. This is from the Nature Tones Better Press ink kit. It's the perfect brown, in my opinion, for the reindeer. So I'm inking that up. First I put it where the registration plate told me to do, or put it. Then I'm inking it up and then putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. So with that reindeer pressed, I'm ready to move on to the next plate. I want to use some embossing ink, and I don't want the ink or the embossing powder to stick to the ink I've already pressed. So I'm using an embossing powder tool to go over that paper to make sure that that ink or that the embossing powder is only going to stick to the ink. I still have to use a soft brush to clean it up, but it's a lot easier to use the embossing powder tool ahead of time to minimize that. So I just used a Versamark ink on the next piece. It looks kind of like a scarf. It also has the ornaments hanging from the antlers of the reindeer. I'm using a red glitter embossing powder. This is one that I've had for years. I actually don't even know who makes it anymore, but I'll link to a company, or I'll link to a red glitter embossing powder in the supply list so you know where you can get some. And it's made by Reindeer, and I know that that one, I've got lots of Reindeer embossing powders and they're really great. So I think my embossing powder is so old that it doesn't really totally work the way it's supposed to. Either that or I need to re-ink my Versamark pad, which is also a possibility. So I definitely have some missing marks. The easiest way to fix that is to use an embossing pen. This one is a distress embossing pen. Versamark also makes their own embossing pen. And because I already know exactly where this plate goes, I can use that pen to color in some of the bare areas, and the embossing powder will stick to that, and then I can emboss it. So you can do that as many times as you need to. This is a great way to fix embossing areas unless it's really, really thin. Sometimes it's not easy to do it when it's really, really thin, but for a thicker area like this, it works perfectly. And this creates a really nice pop of color with that red glitter against the background that I'm going to do. I love the fact that this plate comes with a die set in it, so you can cut out this reindeer and put them on a different background. I think that's a fabulous thing. There is going to be the white halo around that. I'm totally fine with that for what I'm looking at, or for what the look that I'm going for. It just kind of makes the reindeer pop. If you don't want it like that, you could take a tiny, tiny blending brush or a tiny, tiny brush, and you could ink around it. But like I said, I don't mind that. For the next, or for the background, I'm using that sprinkled confetti plate, and I'm using it in my glimmer system with some white foil. I have a package here that has white and black in it, and it's perfect. The white is perfect for this background. I'm foiling on hammer mill cardstock. If you've never foiled before, I have a playlist with lots of different foiling videos in it. You just use your glimmer system, let it heat up, put your plate on there, and then the foil with the pretty side down, and then your cardstock over top of it. Press the timer button, and once that timer button has stopped flashing and is a solid, then you can put it through your die cutting machine. You need the glimmer machine for the heat and the die cutting machine for the pressure. For the sentiments for this card, I'm using the Mistletoe Greetings set. This is a press plate set, but press plates can be hot foiled, which is fantastic. And I'm doing it with some red foil. So that's going to tie in beautifully with that red scarf and ornaments, or leash and ornaments, whatever that is, on the reindeer. For my background, because I have white foil on white cardstock, I'm going to do some ink blending, and that foil is going to resist my ink. I'm using Distress inks. They are a dye-based ink, so it's not going to cover up that foil. The first color I used was Tumbled Glass, then I'm using Salty Ocean, and then next Uncharted Mariner. And I'm using a really large blending brush. I really love these for doing backgrounds because they cover a larger area. And I find, especially with larger areas and backgrounds, I don't get the brush marks or the brush strokes, and they come together a lot quicker. I'm also doing a little bit of that Uncharted Mariner around the sides. I kind of like how it turns into like an arch, kind of. I think it really highlights the reindeer, but you can see how the confetti or the snowflakes really pop once you put that ink on there. I'm using a little bit of a paper towel in order to rub off any excess ink that's on there. You can see that my snowflakes are not pristine white. This is a matte foil, so it is going to resist the distress ink, but some of the ink does stay on there. I don't mind that. You still get the look of the flakes. If you want something that is pristine white, you could do the ink blending background first, use embossing powder tool on top of it, and then use that press plate with some embossing ink or white ink, and then emboss with white embossing powder. And then you would also get a little bit of dimension from those flakes. So a few different ways to get a similar look, but I wanted that background to be a little bit more subtle, and I knew that there was going to be a slight blue hinge to those snowflakes, and I don't mind that because it makes it highlight the reindeer even more, in my opinion. So I'm going to glue that reindeer onto that backing. I've already glued my background onto my card. I did cut a 1/4 inch off. I did 1/8 of an inch on each side using my Spellbinders guillotine trimmer. And this way I have the nice matte from the white card background. And then I'm putting my sentiment on top of there. Now the cool thing with those sentiments is I have a bunch of them, so I'm going to use a couple of them with the cards in this video, and the rest of them I'm going to save for future projects. I always love being able to do multiple sentiments at once. On my ornaments, I put a little bit of glossy accents just to give them some shine and dimension. And then on the tip of the reindeer's nose, I put some red berry nouveau drops. This is just going to give him a red nose, and I always think it's a fun twist on a reindeer for holiday cards. So I'm going to set that aside to dry, and you'll see it again at the end of the video. For the next card, I'm using the Color Mix Joy set, and there is the registration plate for this, but I kind of thought I would do this a little bit differently and spell joy horizontally on a horizontal card. So here I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch cardstock. I'm just laying it out just to make sure that it's going to kind of give the look that I'm going for. And originally I thought I would put all plates on at once, but I do end up changing my mind because putting all the plates on at once, I don't think there's going to be enough room on the outside of the cardstock for me to trim it down a little bit to be able to see the base or be able to see a mat around it. So I decide to do the O separately and then cut it out and pop it up just a tiny little bit. It's going to give the card a little bit more dimension, and it's going to make those letters fit a little bit better on the card. Now, when I'm placing these letters, I'm paying attention to the top and the bottom of the J and the top and the bottom of the Y, and I'm trying to even it out. In hindsight, after seeing the final card, what I wish I had done was concentrated on the top of the J without the dot and lined up the Y with the top of the J without the dot. I think it might have looked tiny little bit better. I still love the way the card turned out, but one of those things, if you look at it at the end and you agree, or you think, yeah, I think it would look better if that Y was down a little bit, this is where you would fix it. This is where you would adjust the placement. When I'm placing them, I'm looking at the lines around the outside of the 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch square there, and I'm making sure that those letters are evenly spaced between them. or rather an even amount away from the edge. So that first color I'm inking with is Abandoned Coral. Now I am going to do this twice because there's a few areas that are the ink is a little bit thin and I want my ink to be nice and solid. So I have yellow tape holding my gray base mat in place, making sure that it doesn't shift, and it works perfectly. I've never had the base plate shift on me. Coming up in this video, I'll have one of my plates move on me, but that's because I didn't actually notice it was moving. You'll also notice that because of the size of the distress pads, I get a little bit of ink on the background of my Better Press plate. I use a damp cloth and I wipe that off before doing my pressing, because sometimes that will transfer to your piece and I don't want that. So the easiest way to prevent that is just to completely clean that off with a damp cloth. It's one of those things that gets a little bit tedious, but it's no different than making sure that your embossing powder is away from where you want to emboss and using a brush to clean that off. So it's something that I willingly do, knowing that I'm going to have a much better final result. So there we have the J and the Y. The Y was done with Saltwater taffy. Next, I'm going to do the O, and that is going to be done with Salvaged patina. So this is a non-traditional color scheme that I've been absolutely obsessed with lately. I typically go with more traditional colors, but I absolutely love the corals and the teals together with this. So I'm going to do this card with it, and I'm going to do another card later in this video with this color combination. I absolutely love it together. Now, I have a bit of a theory with press plates that kind of gets a little bit confirmed later on this video. You know how stamps, when you first buy them, they sometimes don't take the ink very well because of manufacturing residue? I think the same thing happens with press plates, because I find that if I've used them a little bit, they take the ink a little bit better. When they're brand new, sometimes that ink beads up on them a little bit, especially distress ink because it's a dye-based ink. So that is why I'm having to do this a couple times. Now for my next card, I test that a little bit when I make a mistake, and then it ends up getting tested and it kind of confirms it. So if you're having a problem with your press plates taking ink, maybe ink them, wipe the ink off, clean the press plates, and then ink them again, just to get them to take the ink a little bit more and remove any residue on them. So I have a tiny little bit of ink transfer on my background here. I'm using a sand eraser to clean it off completely, and it totally cleans off that background and makes that ink go away. It wasn't really dark. It just kind of made that piece of cardstock look a little bit dirty, and we don't want that. My O is done and it is completely cut out. I just did some very simple fussy cutting around it. And then I took my piece here with the J and the Y and I cut 1/8 of an inch off of each edge as well. For my sentiment, I am using the Sending Joy Sentiments set, and I'm going to do them with the Abandoned Coral Distress ink as well, so that it coordinates beautifully with the colors in the background. I'm just going to use the scrap that was left over from doing my O. There's enough space there. So I have my sentiments on the side. I'm taping that piece in place again, and then I'm going to ink up those plates and press them through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And once again, making sure to clean off the base of my Better Press before putting the top on the base. Now, I've considered getting mini distress ink cubes for this particular reason, but it's really not a huge deal to just make sure to clean off the background before putting it through your Better Press. So, and I also don't want the expense. So if you have smaller mini ink cubes, you probably wouldn't have this issue quite as much. Once I have my image down, I'm going to match up the dies. I like to tape them in place just to make sure they're not going to move and shift on me when I'm die cutting them. And we get some beautiful die cut sentiments that are going to match my card beautifully. I picked the one that I'm going to use and put the others to the side. I took a scrap of cardstock and just did another die cut of the sentiment outline and glued that to the back just to give it a little bit more stability. And now we're ready to glue our card together. For my card base, I'm using some Teal Topaz cardstock from Spellbinders. I'm going to put some die cuts on the front of this. I'm also using that same Teal Topaz for some of the die cuts. I also want to give a little bit of dimension to that O because it's separate anyways. might as well make that a little bit more prominent and add a little bit of dimension. So I have some thin foam tape here. It's not going to add a ton of dimension because my die cuts are also going to add some extra dimension, but I do want to pop it up just a tiny little bit. So put that on the back of there and then put my O down, and we're ready to add some of the die cuts. So these are from this Poinsettia spray die set from this collection. I have some holly leaves die cut out of that teal topaz, as well as Waterfall cardstock. These are all Spellbinders cardstocks. I have a poinsettia die cut out of pink sand cardstock. And then I have some holly berries die cut out of Dahlia cardstock. And the Dahlia cardstock looks really nice with the abandoned coral distress ink. The Saltwater taffy is somewhat close to the pink sand, and it's going to add a nice focal point. So the little holly berries, there's a base to them, and then there's individual berries. I'm just adding a touch of glue to the base, and then I'm going to use a jewel picker to put those berries on. It would be next to impossible to do it with your fingers. You could also use some tweezers to do this as well, but I find the jewel picker is the easiest way to do it. I like to assemble these ahead of time just to have them completely dry and ready to go when I'm assembling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that O into a wreath, but I still want to have the better pressed image behind it. So I wouldn't want to do this without that. It's going to give me a guideline where I'm putting my holly leaves. And also there's going to be a few areas that are visible, so you're going to be able to see that better pressed O behind there. I'm doing 2 holly leaves with the teal topaz, and then I'm doing 1 with the waterfall. It's just going to give a little bit of color break and color variation to this. I didn't do any ink blending on these, but you certainly could. I wanted to create a card that was fairly clean and simple without any ink blending, so that's why I didn't do it here. I am, however, using my fingers to shape those holly leaves into kind of an S shape, and I'm only putting glue on the base of the leaf and having them go over the other leaves in the wreath. So it's going to give a lot of dimension that way, as well as some fantastic texture. Now the holly die, when you die cut it, it cuts out 8 holly leaves, and at this point I had cut out 2 of the teal topaz and 1 of the waterfall. So it only did about 1/4 of the wreath. So I went and die cut more and then filled out the wreath. I did have a bunch extra. I like to put them in Ziploc bags. I'll just save them with that die set and use them for future projects. I added a silver bow to the top, just using some silver cord that I had. Those are the leftover holly leaves that I've had. I'd rather have more than not enough. When I was first die cutting them, I was totally underestimating how big the wreath was going to be and how full it was going to be, but I absolutely love how it turned out. So it's really nice that that die cuts 8 of them at a time, so it doesn't take too long to die cut a bunch of them. Now I'm going to glue on the berries. I'll have to readjust some of the berries once I do the sentiment, and you'll see that in just a moment because I end up covering them. Because those berries are on that base, they're much easier to glue down. I am using some reverse tweezers. These are Spellbinders reverse tweezers that I'm using to hold them while I put the glue on. I love reverse tweezers because you can move a piece from one hand to the other without needing to hold on or squeeze those tweezers to hold it. I used a silver gel pen just to add a cord or a hang tie to the top of that wreath. You could also use the same silver cord that was used with the bow, but that would have needed to be done before this joy part was put onto the card base. And A, I didn't think of it at the time, and B, the silver from the gel pen is just as easy. I added a little bit of stickles to the center of the poinsettia and the center of the berries. They're just going to add a touch of sparkle and a little bit more texture. And then I'm going to put this Sending Joy sentiment right in the front of that wreath. I put a few foam pop dots on the center so it will stick to the card base. And this is when I noticed that I completely lost a bunch of those berries. Thankfully, I have one extra one here. I'll put it in, but I do go and pull out the other ones that are kind of hiding. The ones on the left or the right side where I'm pulling right now, you can kind of see them, but I wanted to see them a little bit more. So I do take them off because the glue hadn't completely set yet, so I still had a little bit of wiggle room there. Now for my third card, I'm using the color mix Mary, and I am going to place these dies the way that they were intended for from the press plate set. I'm using the registration plate or registration card, taping that down to make sure that it doesn't move. I think this one would also be a fun one to do, similar to the Joy, but do kind of a slimline one and having the letters horizontal. However, they're not all the same size, which is part of the fun of it. So you'd have to be okay with the Mary being written out without all the letters being exactly the same size. For this particular one, I'm using bundled sage for my ink on the E and the Y. I'm going back to a very traditional color scheme with this one here and cleaning all of that ink up when or around the press plate. Now, when I'm cleaning the ink up, I'm trying to make sure not to touch my press plate and rub ink off of there. So there's the odd time that I'll have to go back and touch something up because I have touched that press plate. Once I have that plate inked, I can run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. And these ones I will have to do a couple times. And this is where I was really wondering whether the ink beading up was because of manufacturing residue on the press plates. So I inked it up a second time, and that is enough to get enough ink on there to have a nice solid image. I think too that with smaller pads, you would have a little bit of an easier time getting the ink just in the one area. The other thing, I really think that some of my ink pads need to be ink or re-inked, but I didn't want to do them while doing this because I didn't want to have areas of really juicy ink seeping out from my press plates. The next two letters are M and R, and for this one I'm going to use Lumberjack Plaid. This is a nice bright red ink, and I love using it for Christmas cards because I love this shade of red. Once again, inking those and then cleaning up those areas. It's one of those things, like I said, it's a tedious job to ink or to clean up those areas, but you get such a nice result from it, and I don't want to risk any of those ink bits that are on the background transferring to my card, especially with dark colors like this Lumberjack Plaid. It would be a lot harder to fix this with that sand eraser. I don't think it would really be done, and it would have to be done over again. So for this one as well, I needed to do it a second time because the ink was not 100% solid all the way through. So I'm inking those press plates again, going to clean off the area. And the one thing that I didn't realize is at some point, either with the inking or with the cleaning off my background here, my R had shifted. So once I go to put this through the machine, I realized that my R had shifted and the placement was off from the first one, and it was off significantly. It wasn't just a tiny little bit that could be overlooked. It was off enough that there was no way that it could be recovered from it. So I needed to do these steps once again. But I kept this in the video so that you could see, because when I went and redid these colors, I only had to do these colors one time. So this is where, this is the mistake one. You can see that R has shifted, and I mean, you could probably put something in front of it to hide it, but it wasn't the look that I was going for. So off screen, I did them again so that you wouldn't have to watch that. But for both of those colors, the Lumberjack Plaid as well as the Bundled Sage, I only had to do them once for the second time. The ink took so much better on those press plates. So once again, if you're having an issue with your press plates, not necessarily wanting to take the ink and they're brand new, it might be that there's manufacturing residue on there and it's just resisting that ink a little bit. Clean them off with a damp cloth and a towel, kind of rub on them to remove anything, and you might find that it takes ink so much better. With this R, I tested that and I rinsed off or wiped it off with my damp cloth, cleaned it off with a dry cloth, and I only had to do that R with one coat of ink. I didn't have to go in a second time. Now I love the way that Mary looked, but I wanted to add a touch of texture to it, so I used the Night and Day Pines from this set. I used one of them and just did them over this background without any ink on it, and it's just going to impress that texture from the plate but not give any color. And it's one of those things that is very, very subtle when you see it, but I absolutely love the texture, and it doesn't mess with those letters in any way, shape, or form, but it just adds some fun texture to that back. And to bring some of that out around the edges of this piece, I'm going to ink blend with bundled sage and peeled paint. So I'm starting with the bundled sage. This is the same as the light green color that I used for the E and the Y. And the peeled paint is the same that I used for the R. I'm using a large ink blending brush again, and I'm just concentrating around the edges. I am going in a little bit on the top right and the bottom left of the piece, just because there's a little bit more open area there, but I'm making sure to keep the area right close to the letters clear without any ink, because I want them to really pop. And this is just more framing the whole thing together. I have already cut this down, so this piece is now 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, so it's cut down 1/8 of an inch around all 4 sides. And I love the way that that ink just totally enhances that background and kind of frames it in. So I'm going to glue this piece to a white card base. I use Barely Art glue to glue most of my pieces together. I have them in a nice fine lined bottle, and I also use an acrylic block to hold everything down nice and flat. I'm using the Christmas die from the Christmas greetings die set. So this has a ton of different greetings in there. It also has Merry as well, but because we are using that press plate for the Merry, I thought just the simple Christmas would look nice towards the bottom. I'm also using a few holly leaves from that Poinsettia spray die set just to tuck in behind this Christmas sentiment. This Christmas has both the shadow as well as the word, which makes it so easy to put onto cards. Once again, I use my jewel picker to put the eye on the, or the dot on the eye for Christmas. The couple of holly leaves here, they're just going to add a little bit of texture. This bottom part looked a little bit plain without it, and I thought it just enhanced the theme a little bit more. So I'm placing that Christmas down where I'm wanting it to go, but I'm not actually having it glued down. This way I can just put those holly leaves where I want them to go, and then I can glue down that Christmas die cut. And I absolutely love how this card is simple, but not simple, but it's also got some really bold impact with that color mix Merry. Now I kept this card fairly clean and simple, but if you wanted to add a little bit of shimmer to it, I think it would be really neat if you outlined the letters with like a shimmer pen, or even just did say one side of them to it, so that when you tilted it in the light, it just kind of caught the light a little bit. For card number 4, I'm using the Poinsettia spray die set. This one has lots of greenery as well as poinsettia and some other flowers, and creates a beautiful spray for the front of cards. I'm using poppy field cardstock for the poinsettias, and they're really easy to assemble. There's 2 pieces to each poinsettia, and there's a small one and a large one. When you put the pieces side by side, there are 2 sides that look fairly similar. I put a dot of glue in the center of one, turn the other one 180 degrees, and then put that die cut on top of it so that all the petals kind of inlay between each other. For the base of the holly, I'm taking each holly leaf and I'm just using a little bit of Forest Moss Distress ink, just ink blending the bottom of that. You could also use an ultra sticky mat to hold these pieces in place when you did the ink blending, but I just did it very quickly by holding the tip of the leaf, using the brush on the base, and it's just going to add a little bit of visual dimension. There's 2 different shaped holly leaves here. One turns one way and the other turns the other way. So you do need to pay attention when you're gluing them down as to which one goes onto that base. For my poinsettia, I'm just using a little bit of Lumberjack plaid in the center. Again, just giving it a little bit of visual dimension. And I do clean off my work surface quite regularly while I'm doing this to make sure that I don't accidentally get any ink where I don't want it to go. There's some little flowers that are almost like kind of trumpet type flowers. This is the base piece to them, and there's 2 layers that go on the tip or the floral area. So I used a little bit of that Lumberjack plaid on that base just to give it a little bit of shadow. And then I used that same Lumberjack plaid in the center of these flowers here. They're just die cut out of Spellbinders watercolor cardstock. It's a nice off-white color, and that red in the center is going to tie those florals in with all of the other florals in this background here. So while that ink is drying, I clean off my surface once again. And for these little trumpet pieces, there's a piece that is solid that I did in gold. And then there's a piece that is the same shape but has an open center. And I did that in the poppy field again and glued that on top so that that flower has a gold center. That gold cardstock is from the Spellbinders Treasured Gold cardstock pack. There's 5 different gold finishes in there and 3 sheets of each, so that's perfect for holiday cards, and it goes a really long way. There's 15 sheets total, 5 different finishes and 3 sheets of each, so you can get a lot of holiday card making out of one pack. For the background for this card, I'm using the Starshine background. This is just a piercing plate. There's 2 different plates in this set. There's an outline die as well as the piercing plate. Because I knew that I was going to cut this piece down, I didn't need the outline die. The outline die just cuts it at 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and that's the size that my piece of cardstock was. Once again, I cut 1/8 of an inch off of each side just to make sure that I didn't have any edges showing from that die. I'm ink blending around that piece with that bundled sage as well as the forest moss. These are the same 2 colors that I ink blended the last piece with. It's just going to once again give a little bit of shading to the outside and kind of frame this piece in a little bit. And it also enhances that piercing pattern in the background. I'm concentrating this inking on the outside areas because I want my poinsettia spray in the center of my card to really pop. And by keeping that the natural cardstock color, it will easily do that. So I'm using the large ink blending brush for this, even though I'm only doing just a tiny little bit around the edges, mainly because I already had it from before, but it makes it go really, really quickly and easily using it for just the edges of cards as well. And it's also very comfortable to hold in your hand. So it's a really nice ink blending brush for using for card bases or backgrounds. I absolutely love it. It also works really, really well with stencils, especially stencils with larger areas to them. You get those done really quickly and easily. So now that I have the pieces to my card prepped, we can start assembling. I'm using a 1/4 sheet of poppy field cardstock for the background of my card. I did it on a white base. I have a lot of Christmas cards to be doing, and I didn't want to use up all of that poppy field cardstock, so I decided to just use a 1/4 sheet rather than using that for my card base, but you certainly could do that as well. And then my ink blended pierced background from the Starshine background plate. Then I'm going to glue down my holly branch from that poinsettia spray. I like to put that acrylic block on my background to hold everything nice and flat while they're drying. It just frees up my hands and lets me do other things while I'm waiting for things to dry. I put it in between different areas while I'm adding glue and whatnot. So like I said, it just frees up my hand. I tend not to like to sit and wait for glue to dry, so I don't have to do that with this. For my poinsettias, I like to shape the petals with my fingers. You could do this before assembling them together, but sometimes it's easier to assemble them and then shape them all at once and not have to assemble something that's already been shaped. And the shape of these petals makes it really easy to do after the fact. I'm going to glue those in different spaces, and I'm using the same layout for this die set as is on the front of the die package, so I'm not changing where any of these flowers are. I'm going to do another card with this same die set but in a different color scheme, and that one I will change the flowers up a little bit. So just know that you can leave them exactly how they're meant to be on the front of the die cover, or you can change them up a little bit. It doesn't matter, and you still get a great result. The last piece, or the next piece that I'm putting here, are the holly berries. And then I'm going to put those white flowers that have the Lumberjack plaid ink blended in the center of them. Those ones too, I'm just using a little bit of shaping with my fingers and just putting the glue to the center of those flowers before gluing them down. Now, I tend not to send my cards in an envelope, but you certainly could. It would flatten a tiny little bit. If you were worried about that, you could, and thank you, Jennifer McGuire, for this tip, you could take your glue bottle, squirt a tiny little bit of glue behind the petal and let that totally dry before putting it into an envelope. And that way you would have something there just holding that dimension a little bit and holding that petal up a little bit. I added a tiny little bit of glossy accents to my holly berries and then a little bit of glisten stickles to the centers of those poinsettias. The glisten stickles has some gold flecks to it, so it coordinates beautifully. For the sentiments, I'm using the Merry sentiments that I did at the beginning, or that I foiled for my first card. One of those sentiments was a solid foiled one and it said Happy Christmas. I live in Canada, we don't say that, and I don't have any British or English relatives or people to give this to, so I decided to use that and create a gold or a red foiled shadow for my other sentiment, and then finish the card off like that. For my last card here, I'm using that same poinsettia spray again, but I'm changing up the color scheme. So I'm going back to the teal topaz cardstock, the pink sand, the Dahlia, and the Waterfall cardstock. I'm using some abandoned coral, saltwater taffy, salvaged patina, and evergreen bough for doing some of my ink blending, just to give it a little bit of natural dimension. A lot of these pieces I assembled off screen because they're exactly the same as the card before, just a different color scheme. For my background, I'm using the plaid embossing folder that's in this collection. It's going to give some nice plaid texture to it. Now, originally I was going to do, and I'm going to show you on the video, do a little bit of inking on that plaid background with the Salvaged patina, just to give a little bit of light color to it. But in the end, I didn't like the way it was going to look behind that floral spray, so I just used a plain background. But I wanted to keep that piece in here so you could see how it would look if you ink blended it. I'm only ink blending with a brayer so that that ink only goes on the top, as well as it being a lighter coat of ink. If you were to use that ink pad directly on the paper, your ink would be a lot darker, a little bit more risk of getting some of that ink on that background. So I inked it on the top, and then I started doing a little bit of ink blending around the edges, and that's when I really started not liking it. Now, for some things it might work, but this is the point where I'm like, it's gonna take too much attention away from that poinsettia spray, and I thought it would look so much better just having the texture of a plain background. And this is watercolor or Spellbinders watercolor cardstock that I did my embossing with, because I like that nice off-white color for these cards. It just gives it a nice warmth to it, and it matches the better pressed pieces so beautifully. It's a nice color tone, or a similar color tone to that. For the quarter sheet for the background of this card, I used that Dahlia cardstock. Once again, only using a quarter sheet because I didn't want to use up all of my cardstock. I've got lots of white for card bases, so this way I get the same look, but I don't use up as much of that colored cardstock. For this poinsettia spray background piece here, this one's done in the Waterfall cardstock. It's a nice light aqua color, and I absolutely love the color of this. To do this a little bit different from my last card I had the stem down and the spray facing up. This way I'm doing it the other way. I'm just kind of hanging it a little bit, so the stem is at the top and then the spray is hanging down from it. Once that base piece is on there, then I can glue down my poinsettias, once again shaping them as I'm gluing them to my base. And then I can start assembling the rest of the flowers. And this is where I do a little bit of a different layout from the front of the die package. My brain is totally going here. We're going through a heat wave, so I'm finding words and thinking and coming up with things to say a little bit hard. So after those poinsettias are done, now I can glue in the light pink flowers. So these are the ones that I did with that Waterfall cardstock for the last, or watercolor cardstock for the last one, and just ink blended with the Lumberjack plaid. For this one, I did them with the pink sand cardstock, and then I did a little bit of ink blending with the Saltwater taffy, just to add a little bit of dimension in there. And you can see that I'll put a flower down and then sometimes change where I want it to go. I'm kind of trying to spread those poinsettias and the white flowers, and then just having the little trumpet shaped flowers in between those to fill those areas up just a little bit. For my holly for this one, I also did two color combinations. I did some with the Waterfall cardstock and some with the teal topaz cardstock, but I did my ink blending on the base of those leaves with evergreen bough, the same color for all of them. And I just love the look of the different colors of those holly. It just gives it a little bit of variation. I used a Season's Greetings or sentiment from the same set that I did for the Sending Joy. I think it was called Sending Joy Sentiments. So I used another one of those because the colors blended beautifully. It was the same color scheme, so it worked perfectly with this. To finish this card off, I have the centers of my flowers silver. I did them gold with the traditional color scheme. For this one, I did it silver. And then also added a silver bow just at the top of that little spray. And then I'm adding a little bit of glossy accents to the holly berries, as well as a little bit of stickles to the centers of the flowers. I always love stickles in the centers of the flowers because it just adds just a touch of sparkle and a little bit of texture, and I think it finishes them off nicely. So here are my Christmas cards in July. I absolutely love the way they look. And like I said, I can't get enough of that non-traditional color scheme, but I do love the traditional Christmas colors as well. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and learned a few things. If you have a favorite card, pop it in the sentiments or pop it in the comments. I'd love to hear what your favorites are. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here and spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.